welcome to the Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Danny Anderson, formerly of Sectarian Review and now of Freedom. Danny is a professor of literature at Mount Aloysius? No. Yes. Okay, Mount Aloysius College out in Pennsylvania. One of my old stompingest grounds. You know, when I say Pennsylvania, I mean Pennsylvania. And I don't mean that insultingly. It's just sort of a sociographic descriptor. So don't think Philly is what I'm saying. And we are about as million miles away from that as we could be, both the Christian college part of that and the Pennsylvania part of that, in the works of Michael Shea. And I wanted to talk to you about the works of Michael Shea, one, because he died almost a decade ago now, but it seems like recently, in the last 3 years, he became a cause celeb in like the I would say dark fiction, weird fiction, literary and podcast universe again. And it felt a little random to me. That I think what prompted it was the release of the book that we're talking about, which is his collected Cthulhu mythos stories, which came out in 2017. In a new edition. I don't think it's the first time they've been published together. It's just this was the first time they'd all been collected together. Called Demiurge, A Complete Cthulhu Mythos Tales of Michael Shea. And then he became kind of a cause celeb again because one of the stories in this collection became the basis of a Guillermo del Toro sponsored short film on Netflix. Netflix? Yeah. Netflix.
Yeah, it's Cabinet of Curiosities. Actually, I don't think that's in this collection. That's the Autopsy. That's like a standalone story of his. But I don't believe that one is in this collection. I think it's the third episode of Cabinet of Curiosities.
Yeah, I think you're right. Actually, I do not think it's collected here, and I'm misremembering it because I have read all of Shea, but weirdly, Shea is highly anthologized.
Yeah,
but not often collected. So it's kind of a weird situation where, like, if you've ever gotten almost any of those like modern Cthulhu mythos stories, either Fat Face or Satagwa or Polyphemus or one of those stories will be in there. And so I think I've seen Fat Face like republished like 20 times or something.
That's the one where he sort of kind of found his footing as a heir to Lovecraft, right? And an updater of Lovecraft, not just sort of somebody doing what Lovecraft did. He sort of took what Lovecraft did and really kind of ran with it in a really interesting new direction, which is, I think, part of why he's this resurgence that you're talking about. And the fact that, is it S.T. Joshi is the editor of this, he is a very kind of prominent, I mean, he's the people that media people go to talk about Lovecraft when Lovecraft comes up in the news. So he's sort of like, in many ways, the caretaker of that legacy. And so that's obviously he's a fan of Shea. And so I think that's probably that advocacy helps too.
S.T. Joshi is an interesting character in that he's a jerk. Like
nothing about him.
No, I mean, I don't mean that. Like, I don't mean that personally. I've actually heard he's quite nice as a person, but his literary persona is like the most cantankerous, like neoclassical old atheist, like left liberal who also thinks that our modern concern over sentimentality and class stuff is not particularly weird. That's why I actually find it interesting that Joshi loves Michael Shea so much, because one of the things that Joshi actually criticizes most modern world fiction for, I was just reading some of Joshi's essays the other day, so it's in my mind, is being too concerned with character and not enough concerned with the weirdness or alienness of the character, and too concerned with relatability. And what I find interesting in Shea is Shea's the only Lovecraftian writer I know that really gives a crap about being relatable. Like, all of his characters are characters that you might meet. They're very lived in, and they're very. There's a very literary element to Michael Shea that you often do not get in pre-1990s weird fiction. Like,
No, absolutely. There's a real interesting. I mean, he's like committed to expanding Lovecraft's focus. If you think of if you just randomly think of a Lovecraft story, it's some professor who's discovered a book or is on an expedition or something like that and discovers something, and it's all told in the first person. Shea like narrates the lives of people who are definitely not that. We have sex workers, we have people who work in liquor stores, we have comic book artists, there's and bikers. There's all these kind of like street level people that working class people are likely to know, unlike the characters in a Lovecraft story. So yeah, he's actually, I think, ideologically committed to that kind of experience and bringing that Lovecraftian experience to that kind of person.
yeah, what I find so fascinating is basically also as far as like how far can you get from Providence than
Literally.
LA and the Bay Area. I mean, like, and still remain in the United States.
Yeah.
And how far can you get from like the post-Gothic architecture of Lovecraft? I don't, I don't know how people who have read Lovecraft's essays or letters, but Gothic fiction is something that he's both critical of, but the Poe strain of it is like does run through Lovecraft, and I find it weirdly. I'm not saying it's not present here, but it's when I read these, I think far more John Carpenter, but even more literary than I do most Lovecraft pastiches. Like, it's just something different, and I think one of the reasons Shea wasn't taken always that seriously on his own is he's kind of known for these and for the Niftaleen stories, which are these sword and sorcery stories written deliberately, like as a update and rebuke of Jack Vance, which both have demons and horror, but are also making fun of sword and sorcery. Those two things together, I think, when he's coming up in the 70s and 80s, and even up into the 90s and early 2000s, when some of his last work is published, I think those are severely out of fashion. I mean, even when Shea was kind of recuperated, I feel like I first read him in the 2000s in like Lovecraftiana around 4 or whatever that we were on by that time. Like there was this weird internet meme of Lovecraft stuff, and part of it's Lovecraft's interesting, part of it's that it's in the public domain, so you can do all kinds of stuff with it without getting sued.
Well, and Lovecraft encouraged it from the beginning, right?
Right. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I mean, he was known as a, not to speak well of the old New England racist, but he was known for like going in and like writing people's stories for them for pay, not taking pay, and also not taking credit for the story he wrote. Like,
yeah.
And one wishes he maybe had taken a little bit more money and bought more than canned beans and not given himself gastric cancer. So, because apparently eating canned beans at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century was a bad idea as your primary food source.
Probably even today.
Yeah, probably not a great idea now. Yeah, for different, I don't think it would necessarily give you gastric cancer, but
heavy metals, no doubt.
Yeah.
But I just, to back up to something you said, I had written down, because I wanted to bring up John Carpenter as well, because some of these stories topically are treading the same ground as John Carpenter. I'm thinking particularly of the Presentation is a story that reminds me very much of In the Mouth of Madness, and they both, of course, have the common ancestor of At the Mountains of Madness by Lovecraft. But I do think that Carpenter, his work also saw that initial rejection and then subsequent adoption or recognition, right? And I think there's something about two artists that are kind of doing working class, bringing working class perspectives, at least, to this sort of traditional kind of high end of pop culture genre. And I think they're kind of out of step with whatever is contemporarily popular because they're true to what they're doing. And then I think I think entirely fitting that Shea has a similar kind of retroactive acceptance that Carpenter's had. And I have to admit, I mean, I'm kind of on the record, John Carpenter is actually my favorite artist of any medium. I love John Carpenter deeply. And so that's, maybe I'm looking too much for him in Michael Shea, but I certainly did see a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's there both in the source material and in the genre blending, because one of the other things that I think about when I see this is I'm like, every one of these stories is almost in two genres. Yeah. They're all weird fiction, but like some of them are weird fiction plus cosmic fiction, which I don't, that always overlaps, but some of them are definitely noir. Some of them feel, I mean, the one about the wizard and the revenge, that one, what's that one?
I always have to look that Nemo me impune lacet.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce Latin, so yeah. But that's actually like a cross between Poe and Lovecraft.
Right. It's well, and the title's a Poe reference. I mean, like,
the cast.
The Cast of the Amontillado, right?
Yeah.
Like, but also that's the one that's written. It's the only one that's written in a voice that is extremely high Gothic.
Yes, totally. Almost as parody, though. It's actually hilarious to read that voice, actually. But it does sound like something out of Poe's off of Poe's pen, at least.
Yeah, it's that. I mean, and when you realize what's going on in that story, it's like, oh, this guy is getting revenge on his ex-girlfriend, who happens to be a porn actress of some variety.
Yeah. Honestly, the setup reminded me of Ty West's X.
Yes.
Until it diverts a little bit. I was actually wondering if Ty West had read this story before he made X. Then it diverts from that. But yeah, the setup.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's like Ty West's X. If also there were dark underworld gods that actually existed and manifested by the end of the story. Like, exactly. But there, you know, what's interesting about that story stands out to me as different from the rest of the collection in a couple of things. I mean, it is both Poe and Lovecraft, not just Lovecraft. It's also one of the things about Shea that I find interesting, and I would love if like feminist scholars wrote on him. So many of these stories are from a female protagonist point of view.
Yeah.
And one that, I mean, I'm a dude, so maybe I'm the wrong person to ask, but one that I find pretty believable. That one's the exception, and I think that's why the narrator is so pompous, because Shea doesn't like him. It's hilarious until you also realize how awful what's going on is. But it takes a couple of, like, I don't know, when you first read the story, it's so cartoonish that you're like, wait, oh, like, okay, this is actually really messed up. But yes, if people wanted to think about what the setup is, imagine the cast of the Amontillado and Ty West X, and at the end there's a Cthulhu Ex Machina. Like, it's basically that. Like, and told from the point of view of a very crazed wizard.
I'm like imagining someone taking like story dice, and that's just what came out of the can when they rolled it, right? All those things, and he just wrote that story. Yeah.
It does feel like that one's the one I'm like, can we stack up trope after trope after trope, but also make it believable? And it like the thing about Shea is when you describe some of Shea's stories, you go, there's no way that's gonna work as a story. and then you're like, no, it totally did. I don't know how it worked as a story. Like it's kind of maddening like that. I want to talk about Fat Face because it's the other one that's an odd one out. And I think it's also the one that's most well known. I believe it's set in LA and not the Bay, which it's automatically a little different, even though it's pretty clear that Shea knows LA really, really well. I mean, one of the things I can tell you, I know the Bay Area really, really well. And Shea's description of the Bay Area is pretty much dead on. But I gathered that is also true for Fat Face, which is very much set in LA.
And that's important to him because he very often like narrates a character's trip through streets, and he's very careful about naming streets and naming neighborhoods and street names, and the topography of the city is very important to him.
And he gets different characters' voices, I feel like, fairly accurate, or at least you feel like they're similar enough that even someone who is from there would probably, yeah, maybe that's not exactly how they talk, but it's really close.
Yeah.
He's one of these dudes that, you know, when I think about how he could write these characters, I think about like his jobs. Like he was a night clerk in the Mission District. He worked as a construction laborer. He was an EL, an English language learner teacher. He worked as all kinds of. So he basically had the gamut of like. I mean, it's when I mention those jobs, I'm like, okay, so one's white collar, one's blue collar, one's kind of in between. But he just did so many things for work, and he did it while writing. So, so I think there's that, and there's the sense, and like Fat Face, that story could be super exploitative and super seedy. And it goes to places that are I mean, when you like, this spoiler alert for people who haven't read Fat Face, so go find it in one of the 85 collections it's in, or Demiurge, which is the book we're talking about today. But Fat Face's initial like setup is this very innocent-minded sex worker, incredibly innocent-minded sex worker, who is clearly traumatized from something that she witnessed in
a massage parlor or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
Working in a massage parlor that seemed to have been mob owned, and she didn't catch up to that, and she saw something, and they didn't hurt her, but she clearly shouldn't have seen it. And so she's taking some time off and is working kind of as a streetwalker, but she's kind of laying back, and she's in and out of this hotel that's across the street from this. When it's first described, it's pretty hilarious. This hydraulics massage place for what looks like elderly people with weird medical conditions, and also a home for pets. And then it's not that at all, but that's what it looks like. And the initial description of it is so hilarious. But this story, which I said could be seedy. There's a lot of like seedy tropes in it. Every time it could go that way, and in a way that's it is seedy, but in a way that's exploitative, it doesn't do it. It actually goes in another way, and usually a horrific one. Like it continues to be totally surprising. And also the protagonist is portrayed not as stupid actually, but as like too well-meaning to navigate the situation. And even other things that are implicated in this, like the weird clerk that's on the side of the street who like warns her of something, who is clearly not entirely human. like there's 1,000 things goalposting like that she needs to stay away, and there's something really, really horrifying going on, and her friend is murdered, and by murdered I mean mostly dissolved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, no, there's like an interest, like her demise is basically her wanting to give a freebie to this person across the street, Fat Face, who she thinks is a kind person, right? And then, but he turns out to be like a Lovecraftian kind of being.
I mean, literally a Lovecraftian. Yeah.
Yeah.
He become interestingly the one of the reasons why this story is so well known is it actually adds to Call of Cthulhu game lore.
Oh,
like the Shoggoths that can look like humans are called Shoggoth lords. That's actually from this story. It's
yeah, that's interesting. Okay.
And for those of you who know what Shoggoths are, they're, if you've read the Mountains of Madness, they're this weird thing created by another alien race that like has no real form and probably killed their masters. And Lovecraft is horrified by them because they're miscegenated.
Well, I actually think, I mean, the Shoggoths are a very frequent motif in these stories.
Yeah,
they come up. A form of them come up very frequently, if not all the time. And I actually think that's a canny choice, given the fact that he wants to do a lot of like class work in these stories, because you could think of the Shoggoths as a kind of like worker revolution before, you know, in the old world, right? They overthrew they were created to be basically slaves,
basically like a slave revolt. Yeah.
And
it implies in that story that actually we might be descended from them even in the original text.
Yeah.
But in this text you get that, but then you also get this idea. Like the class stuff is interesting because the Shoggoth guy across the street is clearly like a small business owner, is the way he's manifesting himself. But then later on, in another story, we get the Shoggoth in the swimming pool, and it's definitely an attack on like an upper middle class family.
Yeah, yeah.
And it I don't know if those theories were written to be parallel, but they sure are. Like,
and the presentation, the same thing. The being, I forget the name of that mystical being, basically is preying on the super rich in that story, and using kind of working class comic artists to help him create the portal or whatever that in which this happens. And so he's doing really interesting things. And that's not to say the Shoggoths are like they're the villains. That's the being that kills the sex workers in Fat Face, of course. But there's a very complicated and interesting Lovecraftian being to bring into these stories, and to way that he develops them for his own purposes in this new place that he's using them. It is very interesting.
Yeah, it is fascinating to me what he's trying to do here. I mean, because on one hand, you have these cosmic entities, and some of the stories do truly go cosmic. There's that. What's the one that goes nutty cosmic? The one where they're basically moving through LA trying to like stop someone from watching a film that's going to resurrect, like break down the barrier of the worlds. But
John Carpenter has a short film for Masters of Horror called Cigarette Burns. It's very similar in theme.
There's so many. I kept like I was also thinking how much of this reminded me of Prince of Darkness.
Yeah.
There's the obvious comparisons to The Thing, like except that unlike Carpenter, like all of these stories, with the exception of Fat Face, are all within probably 4 blocks of each other in working class Bay Area. Like it's
a lot of them, yeah.
The Mission District and the Tenderloin are spelled out like street to street. And then there are some things in like the suburbs. Like I got the feeling that some of those, like some of what's being described there is like Silicon Valley, although before it was Silicon Valley, because it clearly would have been in the 70s. But the kind of like super rich areas outside of the Bay that now like is the Bay, really.
And I thought that his his vision of the Bay is different. It isn't. I mean, some of these were written in the 2000s when San Francisco was well gentrified, right? And he's not talking about that San Francisco. He's talking about like Dirty Harry San Francisco still, right? And so yeah, he's like creating he's spotlighting a very different version of San Francisco than we want to think about now, at least. So
yeah, I mean, basically, I would say, like, even when he was writing some of these late stories, he's basically creating a Nor mythology. I mean, separate from the Cthulhu mythos for San Francisco that makes most of the city the Tenderloin.
yeah.
Which is just kind of like, if you've ever been to San Francisco, like the Tenderloin district's the roughest neighborhood. It's not quite as bad as like Skid Row in LA, but it's rough. But it's not huge, right? Like, and this was before. This was well before, even in his late stories, like the San Francisco we know now, which is like a playground for the super rich and masses of homeless people. But he basically has like a San Francisco where there are still working class people. It very much feels like, even in his late stories, that it's set in like the 70s and 80s. I was thinking about that the whole time. That's another thing that reminds me of Carpenter. Like, even when you're well outside that time frame, and at least when those stories are published, that's the feel they evoke, is 70s and 80s California.
Like They Live.
Yeah, exactly. It feels a lot more like They Live than like Steve Jobs biopic.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I do. The one thing I will say as well, I think the three stories we've mentioned so far have the most distinct protagonists. There's another story that has a kind of Nora protagonist who's in a bad situation. What's that one? He actually is kind of a gangster. Maybe it's one. Oh, I can't remember.
Yeah, the stories do form like a single world in some ways, and they're kind of hard to disentangle from one another in many ways.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Other than Fat Face, and there is almost a meta narrative to these stories. They build, and one of the interesting things about them, outside of the two stories that we're mentioning, where like, and I think the female protagonist stories in general are pretty memorable, but the ones with male protagonists, I actually tend to find that the side characters in those stories are more memorable than the character. And in that sense, that is a little Lovecraftian, where like the main character is kind of a cipher, and then but you're getting much more of a feel of the world. And you know, that's one of the things with like Lovecraft stories, is even when they have people in them, they don't really have people in them. Like whereas here you're getting like a lot of these are like, well, what is a diner after you get off your like construction shift in the Bay Area, like in 1985. Yeah. Like that's the space you're moving in.
It's like listening to a Tom Waits song in a lot of ways, like an early Tom Waits song. Yeah, for sure. And the ending turns out to be a later Tom Waits song, right? So it gets bizarre and surrealistic. Now, the one exception, I think, another exception other than the Poe infused one that we talked about, is Under the Shelf, which takes place in Antarctica. And
that one, yes.
It's like a multi-level inversion of At the Mountains of Madness, in that instead of two male explorers flying above Antarctica, finding the mountains and going into it, there's two female sisters who are in submarines under an iceberg in Antarctica, looking at it from above, and then they enter it from this way. So it's a literal inversion of At the Mountains of Madness. And these two female submarine explorers are kind of the witnesses to the old one's horror. And so so that's the one that really kind of, other than the Poe one, stands out as completely different than the other ones.
It is interesting. It seems like what ties it to the book is that it's Cthulhu based, and that so many with the exception of Tasagwa and the one about the breaking of barriers, that's like a Cthulhu monster. But you're right that actually at the Mountains of Madness seems to be like the text for a lot of these stories, where like you're playing up different things developing out of the Shoggoths, the old ones. It's very much that strain of Cthulhiana or Lovecraftiana, as opposed to like Sasagra is a weird flawed god, and that's in that story if you get eaten by the frogs, you become eternal and absorbed in them. And what basically Sasagra is doing is maintaining an undying memory of all life, and once you get eaten, you're in it, so you're part of this collective consciousness of things that have been eaten and absorbed into it from all over the universe. But the person that it happens to is like an old woman in a suburb outside of the Bay Area. But the rest of them are mostly like Shoggoths are O1s, are reality breaking down and stuff like that, and they get wild. I mean, I will say this: like a lot of these stories, I think the most rooted ones, Fat Face is kind of interesting because it is the most limited in what it's dealing with. When you get
way earlier than most of them too. Written way earlier. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's written like
in the 80s, early 80s.
Yeah, very early 80s, before he even lived in the Bay Area. And I think most of these stories were written in the 90s.
And even into the 2000s. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Copping Squid does that too. There's a person who wants to be like absorbed into the oneness of this being, and there's some ritual that he has to bring someone as a witness to it, and so that's kind of the premise of that too. And I'm sure that we want to talk about Demiurge separately a little bit, since that's actually new to this volume. That was previously unpublished, but it's like I think one of the most profound horror stories I've read in some time. It's really, really interesting. So we might want to. So what we're talking about is like an inversion of what's going on with Demiurge. So
this is actually one of the things that I was going to point out, that so many of these stories are inversions. So you get Fat Face, and then you get, I forget the title of the story, but about the woman who has the Shoggoth who's put into the pool, and she dives in it and gets dissolved.
The pool.
The pool. Yeah. But then like Beneath Bidmore and Under the Shelf are parallel. I think Demiurge and Copping Squid are parallel. That he seemed to have written stories and then picked an element of them and reverted it or changed the class of the person it was affecting. Or so, for example, in Copping Squid versus the one, I think it's Diagoniad is the one that I'm mentioning before. No, Sasagra is the one with the frog, and then Copping Squid is the one where someone wants to do it, and then Sasagra is just it randomly happens to you. Like they're both ultimately the same result.
Yeah.
But the voluntariness, seeking it out versus being a random victim are played with. There's all these. He seemed to have written like a lot of these. Like he said, I have a theme. I'm going to roll the dice on how I'm going to set it up, and then we're going to get this theme 3 different ways. And then he would do it with another set of characters and a theme from Lovecraft. So as if he'd be like, well, this is all the stuff that would happen if we took this seriously in Lovecraft and really followed it through.
One thing that I think is really interesting about this collection, and I've read this, and I've read his sequel to the Color Out of Space, which is The Color Out of Time, and I think I've read the Autopsy separately. But so this kind of got me into those, though. But and honestly, I think you were the one Carter Stepper, I think you both separately at the same time suggested I read Michael Shea, and so I think I owe you for that. But one thing that really stood out to me on this reading of this collection, though, is the way that Shea's universe is like at a fulcrum between Lovecraft's and ours. So it is not only like a development of Lovecraft's ideas in our world. His world actually assumes Lovecraft's world or Lovecraft's writings exist as well, right? And so it isn't just inspired by them in a separate ontology, right? The Lovecraft himself is a figure in some of these stories, and in fact, he seems to be like the progenitor of these religious texts that people are using in incantations. That's the idea behind the presentation, is they're inspired to create this mural of mythos inspired. And when they say mythos, they mean Lovecraftian mythos, images that will open up this Lovecraftian horror. And so it's like he's actually made Lovecraft. He's not only used Lovecraft fiction, he's actually made Lovecraft part of the fiction. And so he's really kind of blurring the lines between the kind of the cosmic horror that Lovecraft brings and the world that the cosmic horror is aimed at. And it's really, I think, a fascinating artistic move.
Yeah, what I find interesting about that is we kind of like that's done so much now. Like if you think about how, like Lovecraft being in a couple episodes of Supernatural, that show from the aughts, like.
There's that Edgar Allan Poe, the Netflix, the Bluest Eye that brings Edgar Allan Poe into the story.
Right. And I'm not saying it wasn't done before then, but I think that we have to like put Shea in the context of like 70s and 80s metafiction, of which he is definitely not really writing in, but incorporating some elements of. Like,
there's a little bit of Philip K. Dick in him, I think.
Oh yeah, there's a lot actually. That was like the amount of like narrative intrusion and like. But I was also thinking about some other cultural phenomena that were happening in the 80s and 90s. For people who don't know, I mentioned in the beginning of the show, but Danny used to host a Christian podcast that I used to be a guest on all the time. So if Danny does not know about weird occult stuff, I would not be surprised. But there was a cultish movement in the 70s and 80s tied to chaos magic that actually did believe that basically they were egregores in Lovecraft, and like even though that these figures were not real, that they were made real by Lovecraft's creation of them, and thus they were suitable to be used for your own magical evocations. That was a strange belief system of a subcategory of something called chaos magic, which was like developed by Phil Hine and Peter Carroll and some weird occultist Crowley. But this was actually kind of a response to Crowley.
Yeah. But it's consistent with that whole thing. I mean, that's interesting. I hadn't heard of that, but that's actually really interesting.
Mm-hmm. And when I was reading some of this, I was like, does Shea know about that? Because it feels similar, but like, I'm also like, well, we do live in a world where anything said in fiction might actually show up as a weird religious belief somewhere. So like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know that nitty gritty of Michael Shea's life to know if he was aware that was a real thing at the time that he was writing. That people really did think that maybe you could go read horror fiction, particularly Lovecraft, but almost any horror fiction, to start playing with those entities as real entities. So, although I've always like, why the hell would you play with those entities? Like, you're gonna mess with cosmic forces that actively do not give a crap about you. They don't even hate you. They're just like, you're not even worth antipathy, really. Like, it's a very strange worldview when I think about it that way. But like, Shea does so much with this, and I read Demiurge, and I would say it's kind of it's kind of it's a lot. I mean, it's long. It's a novella effectively, and it's a good portion of this collection. It's the only thing that's new to it. I think most of these stories, if they weren't available in some Lovecraftiana anthology, they're available in the Coping Squid. I mean, the Copping Squid. Are I think mostly the Copping Squid. I feel like these stories were collected multiple times.
Some are in Weird Fiction. Some of them came out in that magazine, and Weird Tales. I'm sorry. And so
yeah. Oh yeah, I think a lot of these were. The other thing that is similar to Lovecraft is Shea was still writing where there was significant magazine markets for short stories, which there are today for literary short stories if the literary magazine has an academic sponsor to keep it in print. But in general, there's not really that much of a market for these kind of short stories in the same way, unless you get it. Interestingly, I think the market for a lot of these stories now is like the horror anthology podcast where people will submit stories and someone will read them out loud. I don't think there's much of an actual magazine market for them anymore.
There's a few out there, but yeah, they are kind of rarer, and I think they do, even those tend towards like the literary. And so that's another thing I think is interesting and to me kind of refreshing about Michael Shea is he's totally not of MFA land, right? And so and that's not to completely dismiss the MFA. I think you have one, right?
I do have an MFA. Correct.
That's not to dismiss that, but that is like overwhelmingly dominating the literary, particularly short story literary market. And Michael Shea is like, you're right, writing at a time when just a guy outside the system could submit things to magazines, right? And it doesn't come out of the milieu that of academically aligned presses that the kind of the taste that you would expect that comes with that.
One of the interesting things I would caveat that is today the MFA world has been kind of has had the last laugh with the genre writers actually entering it as professors. So like that's become a recent trend that like people who used to just teach at like Clarion are now actually teaching in MFAs because there's not enough of a market distinction for there to be like we're literary writers and you aren't. We can't really do that anymore. That's also I kind of feel like that's true in poetry too. But I see exactly what you're saying because while I would say that Shea is a highly literary writer, you feel like he got that way from reading Dashiell Hammett, not from going to college.
Yeah.
Like I do believe he did go to college, but I don't think that that's like what's informing his reading taste. Like
it's just similar to like the Stephen King, right? He understands that world, but he's just not of it. And I think that I think in the same way that John Carpenter is like in Hollywood but not of Hollywood, right? And so there's a way, there's like a sort of an insider outsider aesthetic to what he's doing there. So which I appreciate at this point in my life. So
I like it too, and I like it because he takes risks, and I think most of them work. But he takes so on one hand we're saying he's literary in the sense that he's not like a pulp author where there's not a lot of characterization and there's not a lot of concern over line by line like craftsmanship. He's not like a flashy stylist, but there's enough difference in the styles of the stories and in the voices that you can tell that he really does think about it, and they are cleaned up and refined. They're not slapdashed off like, I don't know, like an August Dorleff story or one of what I'm talking about. You read those. There's some weird fiction in the Cthulhu Mythos world that's really like sometimes so aggressively mediocrely written that it's like, wow.
They're mimicking Lovecraft's prose, and when Shea does that, it's for comic effect almost.
Yeah, it's always a joke. But he's not. I would agree with you. this is not Michael Chabon writing Lovecraft stories. You know, Michael Chabon, everyone's favorite, like MFA author who also does genre work, but only as like you still know that it's from an MFA author and it feels like it, right? Like,
yeah. Jonathan Lethem is another one, right? And I love both of those. Are two of my all-time favorite writers. But you're totally right about that.
This doesn't feel like that. Like it doesn't. Nor does it even feel like say new science fiction like J.G. Ballard, where there's been all this literary influence, but they're really more concerned with moving into literature and less in staying in genre. Like, I get the feeling that Shea just doesn't care and he likes genre stuff, so that's what he's writing.
Yeah,
like yeah. Go ahead.
In my little journal here, I try to jot down phrases that I really think are interesting sounding, and so when I was reading this, I got a couple from him. And so, like, this is from the presentation, and I think what stood out to me is it's got this like street language knowledge, but it's also like beautifully crafted and vividly imagined. So the man was beautifully dressed. He looked like some guy in Vogue, lusciously suited, alligator shoes, his face a handsome vacancy, right? It does sound like Hammett to me in a lot of ways, right? And so and just some guy, like that's a term that an MFA program would beat out of you, right? And so but he uses it really, really well. And so I just love the prose style as well as the storytelling. Now I have to say, it gets so psychedelic in some of his imaginings of these creatures that my imagination can't keep up, and I have a hard time picturing what he's describing. I think that's some of his point too. I think that's some of what happens when you're trying to describe the indescribable. Unlike Lovecraft, who just says, I can't describe what I saw. Shea actually does describe it. And then you can tell that it doesn't make any sense to the human mind, right? And so,
right, yeah. Lovecraft always has these kind of like the whole what you can't see is more scary than what you can, and he just tells you that. Like, whereas Shea seems to be like, no, you can't see this. Let me show you. You can't see this. Like,
and then you just can't picture it.
Right? It's just like it's like. And you do feel like, okay, that still works because I still can't really imagine what you're describing. But now I have a hint that it's even wilder than I could have thought it was. Like, there's a whole lot of that. I was thinking about Shea's stories often seem really violent in some ways, but not, with a few exceptions, not in like a murdery way. But they're also kind of like I'm going to be using director analogies so much, my audience must forgive me, but they're kind of like a Tobe Hooper movie. Have you ever watched, like, Texas Chainsaw, which you think is the most brutal movie you've ever seen, and then you go back and watch it scene by scene and you realize there's barely any blood in it.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, this is intensity, and I see the aftermath, but I don't actually see what's happening. Or when I do see what's happening in Shea, I can't comprehend it. Like, there are plenty of times where you do see it and you're like, I don't even know what's going on. What is, like, I don't even know what's being described to me that's happening to this person right now. Like, or you get it through their point of view, such as in Fat Face in the pool, where you're just like, okay, because the end of the pool is wild. Like, it's just like,
it is. Yeah. This substance being comes out of the pool and absorbs the owner and then goes into the house, and there's this oneness of goo. It's like, it's hard to and you have these working class guys who are just there to witness it. And so I think that's kind of like the point. And that's another motif that comes up in these stories, is just the need for a witness to something, right? And it's another rejection of what Lovecraft likes to do, is to tell you don't want to see this. Shea's like begging you to see it, right?
Yeah, someone needs to see this. Like, that's another trope that isn't in Shea that's in Lovecraft. Nobody's mind breaks when this stuff happens, unless they're dissolved into an eternal entity, which then they can't tell where their mind ends or begins. But it's not because they're crazy. It's because literally they're like, the barrier between themselves and others just broke down. And that happens more than once.
And in Copping Squid, that's a good example of that. You have this clerk at a liquor store, I think,
Mm-hmm.
who's a recovering alcoholic who chooses to work in a liquor store. The characters are really, really interestingly drawn, as you said, right? And so, but he kind of finds meaning working in this liquor store, surrounded by the temptation and being proud of himself for resisting, sort of. And so it kind of gives his life meaning. But he gets sort of robbed by a guy who just needs to get cut in trying to get some money from him, because there has to be blood money involved and a witness. And so he gets this guy to go with him to witness him being enveloped into the squid. And then at the end, he's sort of pondering it and considering doing it himself, right? It's sort of, the story sort of ends with his just contemplation of that as an idea. It has not broken his mind. He's actually incorporated it into the logic of a human being, which is what a typical Lovecraft story, it's just impossible.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting because you just sort of go, well, has he? He's clearly not crazy, but is he crazy? Like, it's that's a huge thing. I mean, honestly, I've also, like, both in the games and in fiction, the way Lovecraft treats mental health is just like, well, apparently everyone's mind is just about to completely break at any minute. So, like, you better roll your sanity check. Which is not how this works at all. Like, this has a much more sophisticated view of, like, mental health. And then when people do seem to lose it, the story tries to illustrate to you why. Like it's not like, oh, they just broke. It's like, no, like, I'm describing this. Do you understand it? No, you don't. So, like, this is, could you, like, make mental sense of what you just saw if you saw this? And in this, Shea's answer seems to be, well, kinda, like, but you can't picture it though. Like, you can't really construct it, but it's not like it's totally outside of your realm of comprehension. And I think that's an interesting take on this. I guess this leads us to give turn the pivot to the Demiurge novellas. If you want to take the description
before we do that, can I bring up one other? I think it's connected to this. To this motif of witnessing, right? So, like, all of these, it's like a ritual that needs to have parishioners to witness in order to be enacted, and that's a motif that comes up time and time again. And then very often someone has to do it by their own free will. That even goes in the Weird Poe story. They have to, on their own free will, enter these spaces where they're sacrificed.
Oh, yeah, I forgot that there's, like, Dracula rules too.
Yeah. A little bit, yeah. But there's also, like, monetary compensation is, like, a major theme in this. I just talked about Copping Squid. The guy who gets robbed actually makes money on the transaction because he just has to symbolically give the guy who's robbing him $10, basically, just so some money is transacted in this, some blood money happens. And so he actually profits by witnessing it. The same thing with the presentation. All of these artists get paid exorbitant amounts of money to do these murals and then witness what happens with the mural. And over and over in these stories, working class type people are sort of, like, given money by this Shogothian, these Shogothian entities to actually witness some kind of devouring of the rich, kind of like, and it's like a motif. And I just think it's a really fascinating obsession that Michael Shea has, that he keeps doing it over and over in these stories. And I don't know what to do other than notice it, but I just think it's really interesting.
Not all the working class people are good. That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
But almost all the not working class people are at least obnoxious, if not bad. Like, it's you very much know who he sides with in these characters. Like, like some of the like upper middle class housewives and stuff are not presented unsympathetically, but they're not also presented, like, as good characters. And some of the rich characters, aka like the wizard we talked about in the presentation, are just utterly irredeemable. Like, they're just bad. And that was one of the things about the presentations. Like, there's nobody to like in that story. And that's not true. Like, it's almost the opposite of Fat Face, where you like almost everybody except for, you know, the Shoggoths. But like in the presentation, you don't really like anybody. They're all pretty bad.
The artists, so, and if they're comic artists, and I get the sense that there's this, in this world, there's this thriving subculture of like like underground comics magazines, sort of.
That felt very 90s zine culture. Like,
it very much felt like zine culture, yeah.
Yeah.
But the guy who sort of profits, even when he divides up the earnings, he's given like the bulk of this, he's given like $100,000 or something, and he insists on dividing it equally amongst the four of them that are at that table, right? And so that seems like a benevolent move, but it's actually the distribution of responsibility. Like, they all know what they're doing, kind of. They kind of like, we've read H.P. Lovecraft, we know what this is, I can't believe we're doing this. And so by him like giving them or the quarters of the money, it's actually they're bringing the kind of responsibility for this apocalyptic activity upon themselves. So in some ways he seems generous, but in other ways he's just sort of like spreading out the blame to be
right.
Yeah, so you're right in some ways. Yeah,
so everyone's gonna go down with him.
Yeah,
like it's
morally,
like, yeah, it's just, I mean, it actually ultimately in that story literally too, but I mean, like, it's because yes, it eats the rich first.
You do get, and they all end with like the sense that this is just the beginning of what's happening, right? And that one's no different, right? And so this colonization has just begun. We'll make a lot of money off of it, but okay.
which is interesting, because in some ways I think that actually it's a critique of Lovecraftianism, but in another way it's actually also following the pattern, because it is relatively prosperous professor characters or people who don't have to work, or borderline aristocrats or whatever, who show up in a Lovecraft story most of the time, like degenerated aristocrats in some way or form or another. And in this story, it's like, well, they get eaten first most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time. But the strong implication is that it's eventually coming for everybody, unless you can really try to put some kind of resistance to it together, and usually you can't.
Yeah.
So like,
yeah. The one that kind of like the story that really puzzled me, that I don't even understand well enough literally what happens to kind of talk about, is the battery. And I do get a sense that there's some sort of like old one defender of this world out there, but I don't understand. And so there's some battle about which old one is going to be taking control here. And so that one is a very complicated story, and it doesn't take place in San Francisco. I believe that one's on the East Coast somewhere.
That one's far away. It's funny, I blocked that one from my head, because it's like, wait, we have great old ancient being fan cult battles, basically. Like, I think, I'm not quite sure, but that seems to be what's implied here. Like,
it's almost like a kaiju movie at that point, right?
It's sometimes some of these stories also, like we said, some of these stories are harrowing, but some of these stories are quite funny. Some of them are both. But I find it interesting how many of them stick with me, even though they also kind of bleed together. And I say this with the pronouncement that, like, when you read The Copping Squid, or when you read The Pool, these narrators are very different. Like, they're not, this is not an interchangeable voice. That's one thing I think people should, but still, because they're all so similar in where they're set, except for Beneath the Shelf, to a lesser degree Fat Face. Although I will say, like, the one thing I kind of realized is, I feel like when I said that Shea is trying to make like a Bay Area noir, it does feel like LA is like the cinematic and fictional depiction of LA is like his model for how he's going to depict the Bay Area. And while he gets all the, I mean, like I said, he gets down to what roads are where, right? I mean, he knows the city. That feel is very different. I think it was interesting. One of the things when I was reading about his life, I discovered that, like, you know, Fat Face is an earliest story, but he actually was living in LA when he wrote it. It's just most of his stories came after he relocated to the Bay Area. So it's not even like a thematic thing. It seems like he was writing about what was immediately at hand to him. And And I find that very interesting. I also find like Beneath the Shelf very interesting in that it's not set in the Bay Area, but it's pretty believable, despite the fact that we're going up in a submarine with two women into old one territory. Like it's and you get your plant monsters, your starface plant monster things. So let's get Demiurge is interesting because Demiurge is arguably also. How mythos-y do you think the Demiurge novella is? That was a question I had.
It doesn't feel as much, right? It almost feels like, if it is, it's like a completely unique, almost completely unique take on it. Now, there is the one point in the story where the voice of the story, the whatever you want to call it, the narrator uses as an exclamation by Cthulhu, and so he actually evokes the name of a Cthulhu-like deity, Cthulhu, as his as sort of an exclamation about things. So that is the one moment where you get the sense that there is a creator of this will. And so I guess before we have to lay out the conception of what the concept of the story is. It's basically the first person perspective of this kind of like of this kind of life urge that emerges out of the base of the earth, and as it is consumed by a creature, by a living creature, it inhabits that creature, and then when that creature is consumed by another creature, it inhabits that creature. So there's a sort of evolutionary time as it works its way through the surface, being eaten by microbial beings and that kind of thing, all the way up to like birds, jungle cats, and then it finds a way to get ingested by a human, and then it starts wearing human beings as its kind of host. And so it's a really interesting inversion, like I said, of the whole copping squid thing, where people are ingested into something else. In this case, the life urge, the demiurge, let's just call it, is it perpetuates itself by being eaten, and by its host, the thing that's hosting it, dying, and being consumed by something else, and then it spreads that way. So it's almost beautiful when you think about it, as just sort of a life affirming concept about the eternalness of life, right? And so it's in that way, it is not Lovecraftian. Like even death is just like the route to something greater, right? It isn't like the result of having come into contact with something greater and then you are annihilated. You are sort of assimilated into something ever growing and forever perpetual. So in some ways, it's very kind of like beautiful and optimistic, even though it's kind of horrifying the way that the urge, what it does to people, like as it inhabits them. So there's a little bit of a kind of thing going on in it, but a kind of a arguably positive spin on that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is like if the thing was also maybe the creator of the universe, maybe you're not quite sure, and and you got the story from the thing's point of view and not Kurt Russell's, and it's wild. One of the things that I mentioned Satagwa, is also that I think what ties it in is there's one mention of a Cthulhu being, and then there's the fact that theme has shown up in his other Cthulhu stories. But it does feel very unique, and it's long. I mean, you get more of this than you do for most of the other stories in this collection.
And this being enjoys people. Like it actually is fascinated by humans and wants to learn to speak and everything. And so it pays, again, a teacher to actually give it language lessons, and so that it can actually learn to speak. And so it doesn't have this antipathy towards life. It has this like vibrant love for it. I'm sorry, I interrupted you though.
No, but I think this is interesting because it is sort of like, well, what if something loves life so much that the boundaries between it and life break down, and also it absorbs everything, but it's actually sincerely interested in you. It's not it's not apathetic towards you at all. In fact, its danger to you is that it actually cares.
Yeah.
like it is sort of. I kept on thinking, I'm like, I couldn't think if this was like a kind of physicalization of a Gnostic thing, or if it is just an exercise of inverting Lovecraft, or both. Like,
well, you did talk about how he mixes genres, right? And yeah. At my beginning, my awakening, I was of the earth, right? And so, like this being's first consciousness is as like basically the planet itself, right? And so that does sound very Gnostic to me.
Yeah, and it also, yeah, that's the thing about all your great Lovecraft beings. I mean, here they're truly extra dimensional, but in Lovecraft, they're kind of just really weird ancient aliens who sometimes have godlike powers, but not. We don't. A lot of times they have godlike powers just because we don't know how they interact with our universe. Like, it's not even because they're necessarily super powerful in their own right. It's the way we interact with them causes that. In this, you have like literally something emerging from the earth itself. It's not alien. In fact, that's the point.
Yes.
It's. And so I remember just thinking, like, is this a mythos story in so much that it's literally the anti-mythos story? Like, it's and it's kind of Gnostic in its worldview, but unlike, say, I don't know, it's like, but it's not like super. It's supernatural. I guess it's not religious. It's not numinous in that way. So it's still like a physical being.
I am interested in the way in which, I mean, just coming from a Christian perspective, like it is an extreme variation on like the communion, like, the Christian communion ritual. And so like it is actually spread through the consumption. So it's like an inversion of it again. Like, you're not eating the body and blood of Christ. Like, or we know you are actually, I guess it's actually a Gnostic extension of like the Christian. That's how it gets spread. That's how Christ gets spread into the world, is when we do communion, like by literally eating the body and the blood, if you're Catholic. But in this case, that's kind of how the Demiurge gets spread too, is it has to be consumed.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about Shea, this is not in this collection, but if we think about the Autopsy, for example, there is this theme of like demons and aliens and metaphysical stuff is real, but it's not real in the way you think. They are just physical things.
Yeah.
Like
Prince of Darkness by John Carpenter. Like,
exactly.
That's the same thing there. Yeah.
It's like they're real, but like when you encounter a demon, what you actually encounter is like an endoparasite. Like, and some of them have antipathy towards humans. Some of them have a love of humans. For the human, it gets stuck in it. It actually doesn't really matter which way it goes. But right. like it's not like the motivations are often quite different. And I think that's interesting, because there's a way in which Shea seems just as material. Well, I guess some of the dimensional stuff actually complicates that. But even his versions of immortality are kind of material in a real sense. But that he's not as nihilistic and doesn't laugh at human preconceptions in the same way that Lovecraft does. Like that's a big difference in their attitudes.
No, totally. And that's like a thing that, people about cosmic horror in general, is that it's just indifferent to human beings. And Shea, just in the fact that he centralizes very human character and takes a lot of care in the crafting and the building of those characters, like he's definitely not, doesn't have antipathy towards human beings, right? And so, yeah, there are like real human concerns in the story. And to the point where the Demiurge itself, its human host is Grunt, is what it refers to the man as. Grunt is not like it isn't like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where the demiurge enters the being and it doesn't have any more free will. It's like a puppet. Like Grunt is that like fights back. Like the Grunt is still inside Grunt's body with this demiurge, and the demiurge has to figure out how to kind of convert it, like spiritually almost, to what its will is. And so it isn't like a complete like takeover like the Thing. In this case, there is the human being remains inside that body. And so yeah, I think that's a testament to what you're saying about Shea not being antagonistic towards humanity in the way that cosmic horror can sometimes lead people to be.
Right. For Shea, cosmic horror is overwhelming, but it's not it's not always anti-human. Sometimes it is. I mean, there are stories where, you know, these beings don't care. Sometimes they very much care, and sometimes they care out of antipathy, and sometimes they care out of sincere interest. Usually, if you're human stuck in this, you're dead no matter what. But like it's not the same kind of like cosmic apathy that you get in Lovecraft or John Bell Long, or you know, whatever. And nor is it the moralism of like August Derleth or any of that either. Like it's something else. And I find it very interesting. I also, like you, notice that it has I'm going to make a comparison to ancient world thought. Like, so if you're a Stoic in 300 BCE, you believe that Zeus is real, but that he's a material being, that we're all made out of his material. Gods and these cosmic entities in Shea are like that. Like, they are cosmic level, they are godlike in power, but they are actual beings, and they are material. And so he is still a materialist in that sense, but it's not the same kind of thing as, at least in his world. I don't know about his own personal metaphysical beliefs, that Lovecraft has, where like it's a cold, empty world full of incomprehensible horror that we just can't even begin to comprehend.
Which is merciful.
Yeah, and it's good we can't comprehend it. Whereas Shea's just like, well, you can't really comprehend it, but that's not good or bad. And he seems to think you can comprehend a whole lot more of it than Lovecraft thinks you can comprehend. And in some ways, he proves that that's still scary. Like,
well, yeah, because it puts almost human personality traits in these gigantic beings, right? So to go back to the Under the Shelf story, at the very end of that, the sisters fight off this giant crab monster or whatever it is, and it just sort of like, it seems to just let them go out of almost like bemused admiration for them. I'm just going to read at the end. In the course of those heartbeats, they absolutely knew the brevity of their own lives before the long endurance of this Titan. So that's a very Lovecraftian thing. We are nothing in comparison to this thing, and knew as well, incommensurate though they were with this Colossus, that it saluted their sentience and their brevity, performed for them this cosmic courtesy, salvation, and withdrew to the benthos that housed its hunger life. So this being seems to like actually notice them. That's very not Lovecraftian, right? And it's actually amused at their will to live, and sort of like, it knows that they're a blip anyway, and so it just kind of amusedly lets them go. But that is a major variation from what Lovecraft will do, and it actually shows a sort of a different attitude about our place in the cosmos. I think something that is much more pro-human in Michael Shea. There's a very strong humanist like bent to these stories.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That is the difference. Is if like it's still cosmic, and you're still not gonna win, but it's not totally alien nor totally indifferent, and sometimes its capricious will can work out in your favor. So like,
it's almost absurdism. It's almost like the philosophical school of absurdism.
Right, but it is less nihilistic than or at least in some ways, it seems less nihilistic than Lovecraft. Also, like, there's the obvious inversion. Lovecraft had a penchant for aristocrats and only kind of softened it towards the end of his life, and he was probably, there's some indications he might have slightly softened his racism, but I mean he was racist even by 1920 standards. So like,
and he married a Jewish lady though, right? And so
yeah,
that's an interesting complication. It
yeah,
doesn't work out really well, but
yeah.
I'm
No,
not
married
saying
a
he
Jewish
wasn't
lady
racist, but
and moved to the immigrant car to Brooklyn and then freaked out about it. But
yeah.
um
And she went
but
to Cleveland, I think, my hometown.
yeah, it's I've actually always went like there's a lot of speculation about if Lovecraft and might have died of cancer young, because I mean the one thing is we have to always remind people Lovecraft, if Lovecraft didn't get to either Danny or my age, so like there is some indication that he could have gone the other way, but I don't like overly speculating on that because the kids could have easily actually doubled down on bigotry later. You just don't know.
Yeah.
There's a kind of shift in him. With Shea, however, there is no love of aristocratic anything. There's no contempt for people of color. There's none of that in here. Like, in so much that race comes up at all, it comes up as like a positive descriptor of working class people.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of accepted as a fact of working class life. And yet, while there may be tensions between races or whatever, it's not ever the point of the story, nor is it ever like, nor is that ever. Yeah.
It's a black man that comes in and robs the store, but that's not even the point. The black man is a source of enlightenment in that case, right? And so
Right. Yeah.
really, yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, you know, it's not as on the head as like Lovecraft Country is, where you're deliberately inverting it, but there is just Shea's concerns are clearly with people that Lovecraft would not have taken seriously. And it seems like that's why he has the Lovecraftian classes get eaten first. like,
Yeah.
like, you know, there's both a kind of class commentary in that, but there's also, I think, well, also they're the people dumb enough to get close to that. Like, why no working class person would go anywhere near that unless they were really, really confused or traumatized, as in Fatface, or you know.
Yeah.
So
Well, to
I
the
think,
point. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, you had mentioned earlier Lovecraft's like paranoia about miscegenation and stuff, right? The end of Demiurge, it's triumphantly cross species breeding across species, like where he gets Grunt to sort of mate with a sea lion, which is the carrier of some sort of oceanic demiurge, and then there's this sort of almost yin-yangy melding of the earth and the water there with that kind of coupling. And so like that story ends with a cross species miscegenation, not just like cross race, right?
Right. Yeah. And that was also the hint that there was some kind of actual Gnostic stuff going on, because Lovecraft would never care about elements. Like, so it was just, it's a fascinating collection of stories, and I think interesting in a lot of ways. The sympathetic portrayal of women, the sympathetic portrayal of working class people, the sympathetic portrayal of even like working class dropouts, very Dashiell Hammett style, the noir elements which are all through it. The fact that like when you do get like well-off people, they're basically portrayed as like either loons or crazy people or evil, or even when they're none of those, they're at least annoying.
Yeah.
So like that's very much a thing going on. And I want to echo Danny's, like, he's such a good literary writer without feeling like he's an MFA writer. I don't get that anyone's writing about some professor's affairs in any of these books. Like, and it's refreshing in that sense. So final thoughts, Danny?
I really am grateful that you and Carter Stepper both separately at the same time pointed me in his direction. I think they're really tremendous and unique additions to something that can feel stale after a while, and sort of, yeah, I get the point with cosmic horror. This is like an utterly unique twist on it, and I highly, like enjoyed reading this, and we'll probably revisit these stories in the future. I've taught like little mini classes on H.P. Lovecraft, and I think in the future when I do that, I'm definitely going to supplement some of these stories as sort of counterpoint to some of those stories. And so no, I think it's tremendous. One thing to, if you want, I think a theoretical apparatus to use an English term to maybe give you some terms to think about this. I always recommend Mark Fisher's book, The Weird and the Eerie. And when Fisher in that book, he basically takes a magnifying glass to Freud's idea of the uncanny and kind of zooms in and gives us a little more supple use of that. And he kind of distinguishes the weird from the eerie. And when one thing he says about the weird is that it is something brought from the outside to our familiar world, basically. And that's very Lovecraftian, right? And I think you can use that idea to look at what Fisher or what Shea is doing here. But Shea makes it interesting because he has a way in these stories of familiarizing the unfamiliar. And I think it's a really, really interesting complication on the whole idea of weird and weird fiction. It's a for me, from my reading history, an utterly unique and fascinating approach to it.
Yeah, I'm with you. If I was going to suggest another writer, if you read Michael Shea and you really like him, there's only two writers that I think are equally humanistic and Lovecraftian simultaneously. One is T.E.D. Klein or Ted Klein. Particularly in the kind of hard to get super long novel, The Ceremonies, but the short stories. Klein, however, only has two collections out. I mean, he's kind of like two collections and I think two novels, maybe just one novel. I'm not quite sure. And then Caitlin Kiernan, I would also say is good reading. A little bit more MFAE, I would say, than a little bit less Dashiell Hammett, but still is interesting, the Cthulhu mythos, but still humanistic. So if you're into this, those are also people you might be into. I also think T.E.D. Klein has interesting things to say about class and rural-urban differences and stuff like that that resonate with Shea. And Caitlin Kiernan has a lot to say about sexuality. I think they deal a lot with that, or she. I can't remember what their pronoun is. I'm going to use they to be on the safe side. And so those are the people I would tell to check this out. Who I wouldn't check out, even though I like their work, don't read Brian Lumley or any of the other Lovecraftians if you like this, because you're going to get something very different, more Lovecrafty than this. And while, you know, I like The Good Racist from Providence enough, you know, like
I still love to read Lovecraft. Yeah.
I guess I can separate. Lovecraft biography is actually interesting because he's both a very terrible and a very good person in some way simultaneously, and I think it's good for people to deal with those contradictions morally, that you can encounter someone who has totally reprobate ideas in some ways, but actually kind of behaves morally towards other people.
This is what I love about living in Pennsylvania, as we talked about before.
Yeah. Although, I mean, in Lovecraft's case, it's not like because he's not like some working class with mixed values. It's more just like he fancies himself an aristocrat with their prejudices, but isn't actually one. So and he seems to be fundamentally decent with people he actually interacts with, but he avoids interacting with people. So, although apparently one of the most fascinating things about Lovecraft is he may be the person we have the most letters from, period. There's more Lovecraft letters on like literature and stuff than most modern authors have, like, you know, in all their writing. So I think that's fascinating, which is why we have so much. That's why we know so much about him and what he thought, and both his good and bad points. Shea, we don't have anything like that. Sorry, guys.
He died tragically young.
Yeah.
64 or something like that.
Yeah. And I was about to say, of the I think Kiernan's about Kiernan's younger than Shea would be if Shea was still alive. But like of the three, Shea's in the middle of the age range of the people I mentioned who are like him. So yeah, it was. Yeah, he died. He died young. And honestly, there's the other reason I mentioned he declined is like Shea and him both don't have a ton of material out there. Like they're like I think the Shea's material that gets bulky is his Nephilim stuff and his Jack Vance homages and pastiches. But like his short story output, I think is basically 2 collections.
Yeah.
So
and even like Color Out of Time is quite short. It's a novella. It's not really a novel. So
yeah. So I think that is what I would tell you to check out. And I would also agree, anytime you can read, I like Mark Fisher's literary writing more, or his literary theorizing, probably a little more than I like his political theorizing. I know that's like heresy these days, but I actually think The Weird and the Eerie is a great book.
Really is,
highly useful.
And honestly, as somebody who is rightfully accused of being like a obnoxiously generalist and a little even scatterbrained about things, he covers so many topics and in so many ways, and in so many interesting ways. He just jumps from music to painting to album covers to books to television movies, and that's just sort of my style of cultural engagement. And so I found that book to be really, really fascinating and short and very readable.
Yeah, I would second that. No Fisher book is actually particularly long, except for his collected essays, which are, even for that, not super long. So I would tell people, always read good old Mark Fisher. And even though I should say that I technically work for one of his 2 publicating presses that he was associated with, so I have I no longer get any money from that, so you're not financially helping me. So I'm not corrupt in that way. And I hope. One more thing while I have you here. If people are interested, on the 5-year anniversary on the death, not on the death of Mark Fisher, on the publication of the Vampire Castle essay in 2013 and 2018, you and I did a discussion on that essay. We are now 10 years out, so if you want to know what I thought about it, half a decade ago from something a decade ago that people still talk about in a way that sometimes makes me uncomfortable, you can go listen to that episode of Danny's old show, Sectarian Review, which is all still available, I believe.
Yeah, it's all up there. If you go to, sorry, I wasn't expecting.
That's okay. You don't technically have to plug it anymore. It's your X show.
Castos, and look, you can find it on there somewhere. I'll tell you what, if anybody really is interested in finding the Sectarian Review, will all be up on your podcatchers too still. So I can't remember what episode that was. It was fairly early on. I remember you were like irritated that it was like finally a Christian podcast that asked you to come on and talk about that essay.
Yes, it was. I was like,
should have. It was me.
I was like, I'll say, so people are writing for Jacobin magazine about this essay, but like one of the major people who commissioned the piece is like just sitting around and you know, I not that I totally want to cash in on that, because I have over time. And this is a segment I didn't prep Danny for, but the trajectory of Russell Brand, even since we covered this 5 years ago, has gotten interesting enough for me to be like, this is even wilder now in hindsight than it was in 2018, and definitely than it was in 2013. So, you know, much is to be said about that. So,
but you can also, if you want to find stuff like that, I have a Substack now. It's called Untaking, and you can find that. And I mostly do what I feel more comfortable doing. And I've been getting into a lot more fiction writing. And so for me, that's what's replaced Sectarian Review, but I'm more than happy to shoot you 2 episodes of that. And you were on, gosh, probably 15 episodes of Sectarian Review. Like we talked about so many movies. And one thing I loved about having you, I think everyone calls on you to talk about politics, and I would call on you to talk about like Coen brother movies and Cynthia Ozick books, right? And I think
Coen brothers.
I enjoyed getting that side of you.
And we didn't quite complete all of Tarkovsky's filmography, but we came close.
Tarkovsky movies, yes.
like I think we did 5 of them.
Solaris, Nostalgia,
Solaris, Nostalgia, Stalker, Andrei Rublev.
Yeah. I think we did those 4. Yeah,
we did 4. We didn't do Mirror, and we didn't do
Sacrifice,
and we didn't do Come and See.
Ivan's Childhood either.
Yeah, Ivan's Childhood, not Come and See. Yeah, so we didn't do his first movie and his 2 last movies, basically. I think, but but we did most of them. So
yes. Yeah. So all you people listening to Derek all this time, like, ask him questions about art and literature. Like, and I've had you on, you talked about your poetry books on that podcast. So yeah, you should go check out the Sectarian Review and just filter for Varn episodes. There's a whole bunch of them in there for you. And so,
yeah, your podcast suffered from you and JG Michael are 2 people who I think suffered from I actually am interested in everything.
Yes.
Problem. Like, I think the wildest episode we did together was you, me, and a conservative on the politics show on the Christian Humanist Network. It
was Coil? The Coil?
Coil, yeah.
Yeah.
And we did it on the scandal of the evangelical mind as applied to American politics.
The Mark Knoll book. Yeah, that's right. I do remember that one. Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually one of my favorite episodes. It's one of the only time I discussed politics with you, but it was from such a strange angle that it was because I like that Mark Knoll book, and I think I'm one of the few non-Christians who's ever referenced it at all.
No, it's great. Yeah. Actually I have this little shelf of all the books that I've covered one way or another on that podcast. And so, no, I did enjoy doing it. I'm not saying it'll never come back, but I have no plans to do new episodes of it, but I'm more than happy to come talk to other people. So I'm really happy that you invited me, and it's great to see you again. I always enjoy our time together.
Yep, me too. And I like talking to you because we talk about other things, and this is closer to my day job. So, and it's definitely closer to yours too. So,
not that much of a difference.
Yeah. So on that note, we're gonna roll the credits, and there we go.